أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We continue our examination of how Islamic laws impact minors. In our discussion tonight on page 59 of the book, the author discusses the ibadat of the sabi, the acts of worship of a child who is not baligh. Do we recognize these acts of worship as valid acts of worship? Meaning that the child, when he prays or she prays, is that an actual prayer? Or no, the hadiths that we have that command parents to teach children how to pray, it's only lit-tamreen, just for practice. So they get the hang of it, they get familiar with it, and when they become baligh, they know how to properly pray. Which is it? Scholars are split on this issue. One group of scholars, they state that this is just tamreen. A child who's not baligh, there's no taklif on the child. So it does not even make any sense, Assalamu alaikum, it does not make any sense for the child to offer a valid prayer when there is absolutely no obligation on the child. So anything that the child does is what? Is just practice. So if you have a child who prays, for instance, that salah is not a shar'i salah. You can't pray jama'ah behind him. He's just, practicing. That's one group of scholars. Another school of scholars, another group of scholars, they say no. The acts of worship of a child are shar'i. They are completely valid if the child is mumayyaz. He knows, he's old enough to know what he's doing. He understands that this is a prayer, that you're dedicating this to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then this is a valid prayer, just like the prayer of an adult. What's different? A child who's 10, 11, but mumayyaz, let's say, and he's praying. What's the difference between his prayer and one who's 15? If they both have the intellectual maturity to know what salah is. So this is the second group of scholars. They believe that the acts of worship of a minor, of a child, are valid acts of worship. What do they do with hadith raf' al-qalam? We have a number of narrations that state that the pen has been lifted from children. The pen of taklif. This is just a symbolic way of saying that there's no obligation on them. Nothing's being recorded for them or against them. رُفِعَ الْقَلَمْ عَنِ الصَّبِي. So the second group of scholars, they're challenged with these hadiths. If you say that children and minors can offer a valid salah, it's a shar'i salah, then that means there's some sort of taklif on them. Whereas the hadith of lifting the pen indicates there is no taklif on them, nothing. They're just like an object from a taklif shar'i perspective. Their response to this is that when the Prophet ﷺ states the pen has been lifted from the child, what exactly is being lifted? See, the hadith says something's lifted from the child. The pen is lifted. Something's not being written. What is it that the hadith is negating? What's not being written?
Is it their sense?
Yes, you have the right idea. Scholars say, raf' al-mu'akhadha. That which is being lifted in those hadiths is to hold them accountable for mistakes or sins or wrongdoings. Allah basically saying in these hadiths through the Prophet and the Imams, I'm not going to write any sin for them if they're not baligh yet. Maybe they'll lie, they'll cheat, they'll do some things wrong. but I will not record that as a sin against them. That's what's being lifted in these hadiths. But if the child is doing a good act, like ibadah, like praying, like fasting, why don't we consider it a full ibadah? These hadiths are not lifting the ibadah from a child and saying a child is like an object, a wall. He can't even offer a valid prayer. No. Because ibadah is good in itself. And the child has the intellectual maturity to know what the acts of worship are. In this case, we consider the ibadat of the sabi to be a valid ibadah. And what's being lifted is accountability. That's what's being lifted, not the ibadah itself. It's not, these hadiths are not saying that the child is like a dead person. Nothing can come from them. No. If it's a good deed, Allah will write the good deed for the child. Allah will reward the child for offering that good deed. Yes, if the child skips the obligation, doesn't pray, doesn't fast, there's no consequences for the child. That's what the hadith of Raf' al-Qalam means. Any questions on that?
Which ones say it suspends?
So the fatwa of many of the maraja' today, most of them, is that yes, it is a shar'i prayer. So if the child is of age, has the maturity, and knows what he or she is doing, yes, we consider that as a shar'i salah.
Even if he's like 7, 8?
Yes, even if he's 7, 8, as long as he has the intellectual maturity to know that Allah commanded me to do this, and I can do it properly, fulfilling all the conditions, then yes, why not? Sometimes you have very bright children, they have very good levels of maturity. If they do those good acts, of course Allah will write it for them, why not? There's nothing wrong with that. So this is the ibadat of the sabi. What about the wasiyah and the sadaqah? What's the wasiyah? The will. Can a child who's a minor, we briefly examined that before, can a child who's a minor issue a will and state, if I die, use my money for this cause? This is a wasiyah. And sadaqah. Can a child give sadaqah? The child comes and says, Baba, I have $5,000 in my savings account since I was born. I want you every day to put $1 for Imam al-Mahdi ajjalallahu ta'ala farajah. Or I want you at the end of each month to give $20 to the poor. Can the child do that? The author states on page 60, Al-Mashhur bayn al-Fuqaha. The popular opinion amongst the jurists and scholars is that the sabi, the child, who's a mumayyaz, and reaches 10 years of age, which is usually the age of being a mumayyaz, jazat wasiyyatuhu wa sadaqatuhu. The child is now authorized to issue a will and to also give sadaqah for a charitable cause. We have a number of hadiths from the Ahlul Bayt that confirm this. One hadith is from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, إِذَا بَلَغَ الْغُلَامُ عَشْرَ سِنِينَ. When a boy reaches 10, جَازَتْ وَصِيَّتُهُ. The Imam says that he can do wasiyah. He can issue a will. Then the Imam states, إِذَا أَتَى عَلَى الْغُلَامِ عَشْرُ سِنِينَ. When a boy becomes 10 years of age, فَإِنَّهُ يَجُوزُ لَهُ فِي مَا أَعْتَقْ. If the child owns a slave, now this is no longer applicable, but back then, a child can own a slave. Either through his money, someone would buy a slave for him, or he'd inherit his father's slaves. Now the child is 10, and he says, I would like to free my slave. Isn't this an act of charity? Yes. The Imam says, يَجُوزُ لَهُ. Yes, he's allowed to do that. He can free the slave. أو تصدق. If he wants to give charity, he can. أو أوصى على معروف. If he issues a wasiyah for a good cause. Why deny the child getting the ajr and the thawab of doing these acts of goodness? So we have narrations that if the child is 10, then yes, we allow him to spend his money for a good cause. That is allowed. Now remember, it has to be a good cause. Not other types of transactions, because maybe the minor could be taken advantage of. So most scholars throughout history have issued this fatwa. What about the waqf? Do you know what the difference is between sadaqah and waqf? What is the difference between the two? Sadaqah is any donation, any act of charity. What's waqf?
The other person can do whatever they want with it, the sadaqah, but the waqf, I think, no, it is like on hold.
Yes. The waqf is a religious endowment. A piece of property, you can turn it into a waqf. Whether a general waqf like a masjid, or it could be a school, it could be a Hussainiyya, anything for the general public, or waqf khas. Or you can dedicate this land, for instance, to your relatives, to the people of this city, for instance. A subcategory of people, students, for instance. Now, scholars have discussed whether a child can dedicate something as a waqf am, general endowment. Many scholars have said the child is not allowed to dedicate a waqf, a religious endowment. Why? They say we don't have evidence that he can do that. The default is that a child who's not baligh cannot use his money. We have an exception from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. What were those exceptions? The will, the wasiyah, and the donation. Does the donation technically include a waqf? The author says no. Sadaqah is a different label than waqf and endowment. And that's why scholars in Islamic law, they have a different book to discuss sadaqah and a different book to discuss waqf. Waqf has its own laws. It's a specific type of donation. It's not any donation. So the hadith that says a child can give sadaqah, we're not sure if it includes waqf. Therefore, we go back to the general ruling, which is the child is not allowed to use his property. So most scholars have ruled a child cannot dedicate a waqf until he becomes baligh. Once he becomes baligh, then he could dedicate a waqf. Any questions on that? Okay. Now let's go to page 61 and discuss the heading Taghrimuhu. We're trying to see what kind of laws impact minors, right? So the author mentions that if a child inflicts damage on others' property, as we briefly mentioned before, are they liable to compensate those people for the damage that they caused? One can say, رُفِعَ الْقَلَمِ. There's no taklif on children. I broke someone's window as a child, so what? I broke someone's car. There's no taklif on me. So Islamic law does not require me to compensate that person because I'm a child. There's no taklif on me. The author says no. And Maraji', they say no. If a child causes damage to someone's money or property, the parents and guardians of the child must compensate that person from the child's money. Even if there's no taklif, meaning Allah is not going to punish the child. On the Day of Judgment, Allah will not say to the child, you committed a sin by breaking your neighbor's window. Because there was no taklif on you, so you're forgiven. Don't worry about that. But now that you're baligh, if someone has not compensated that person, you have to compensate him. Because you inflicted damage on the person's property, so you're liable for that damage. So this is a law that impacts minors in Islamic law. That if they cause damage to someone's property, even though they're not held accountable, as they did not commit a sin, but they have to compensate them. So either their guardians compensate them now, or when they become baligh, it's now their obligation to go and compensate them.
So can the parents pay for it?
They can. The parents can go and settle it with the neighbors from their own money. That's fine, because they will release now their child from the liability. But the point is, that person has to be compensated, the neighbor, from the child's money, unless someone offers to settle it themselves. That's fine. So this is one law that impacts minors. Any question on that? And the reason why scholars have said that is because they've made a distinction between hukum taklifi and hukum wad'i. Hukum taklifi means what? There's an obligation on you. This is halal, this is haram, this is makruh, this is mustahab. These are ahkam taklifiyah. And then we have hukum wad'i. Hukum wad'i is an effect in Islamic law. For instance, the marriage relationship. The fact that you have a marital relationship when you say the aqd, the katb kitab, that is a hukum wad'i, a situational ruling. That now you have zawjiyah. Ownership, milkiyah, is a hukum wad'i. And that's why when it comes to these ahkam wad'iyah, you don't need to make the niyyah of qurba. Do you have to say, I sell this book for the sake of Allah, qurbatan ila Allah ta'ala, for you to be the buyer or seller or the owner? No, because this is an effect of ownership. Similarly, we say daman, liability for damage, is not a hukum taklifi. It's a hukum wad'i. Whoever causes damage, there's an effect called liability. There is an effect called liability. In fact, if you let your animal roam around, and because of your negligence, the animal went and broke your neighbor's window, you're still liable for that. Now someone could say, I never broke anything. They'll tell him, yeah, but your horse did. Shu khasni ana. An animal did that. Go and charge the animal. Hold the animal liable. No. You're responsible. When you're the owner of an animal and you let it loose, you were negligent, right? There is an effect in Islamic law. You have to be liable. So the same applies to a child. Another law that impacts minors and children, and I know this one's sensitive, is ta'deeb, discipline. And when we say discipline, what type of discipline are we referring to? What type? Verbal, physical? Physical discipline, right. Is physical discipline allowed or no? Ajma'u, the author says it is the ijma', consensus of scholars. أَنَّ الصَّبِيَّ الْمُمَيَّزِ. What child are we talking about? The mumayyaz. The one who has that maturity to know right from wrong. Let's say a child of 10 years of age. يُؤَدَّبْ عَلَى مَا يَرْتَكِبُ مِنَ الْكَبَائِرِ. If the child commits a major sin, even though there's no taklif, Allah is not recording that sin against the child because the child is not baligh yet, but there is a worldly consequence, which is discipline. If appropriate, within certain limits, the child can be physically disciplined. Of course, not to the point where it harms the child, but there should be some physical discipline to show the child right from wrong. And Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, according to one hadith, in this hadith, the Imam alayhi salam states, during the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam, there was a case where an adult man practiced homosexuality with a child who was mumayyaz, the child. So the Imam alayhi salam punished the man for this, crime, for this act. And the Imam alayhi salam told the child, he told him, had you been an adult, I would have punished you as well. But now I will discipline you. And he had him disciplined. Because the Imam told the child, you could have resisted, but you did not. So you committed what's considered a major sin for adults. But since you're not an adult, so the had, the penal code does not apply to you, but you can be disciplined. So in Islamic law, a child can be disciplined if he does something openly corrupt and immoral.
Do you hit him? You mean hit?
Well, yeah, physical discipline. Remember, this is just a legal discussion here. This is in no way advocating for anything.
No, but I heard, but didn't you say if you hit a child and بتعلم,
Yeah,
you
this,
have to pay صدقة?
yeah, this is an exception. This is ta'deeb, discipline.
If he does something bad.
Yes, if the child does something that's a kabira, that's bad, right? And they know right from wrong. Remember, we're talking about which child? Not a 5-year-old child. Mumayyiz child. Let's say 9, 10. They know right from wrong. They have that level of maturity. And they know they did something wrong. It could be appropriate in some cases to discipline them. Yes.
They killed someone, let's say. The child
Yeah, something big like theft. Let's say a child keeps stealing. And he's 10, 11, he knows. He completely knows this is wrong, right? You discipline the child. Because the argument is if you don't discipline the child will develop the habit. When he becomes baligh, he's going to continue the same thing. So let the child know, no, you can't get away with that. There are consequences for stealing, right? Or for trying to hurt people or kill people. There are consequences. The child needs to know that. So one way to protect the child and to protect society is through discipline. But of course, appropriate discipline. Scholars have mentioned the conditions. When we're saying hitting, we're not saying, physical assault to the point where you endanger the child. No. It must be, appropriate, reasonable, and not with vengeance, but with the compassionate intention to really discipline the child.
not anger.
No, not out of anger or out of revenge. Because that just makes the child more aggressive. So this is another thing that applies to children. Any questions on that? On the discipline, on the ta'deeb? Yes.
But the punishments usually that are like these punishments for the baligh are in public usually, no? For the child it will be like to be disciplined in...
Scholars have not mentioned whether this is public or not. Maybe we can conclude from the hadith of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, it may have been somewhat public to have more of an effect so other children see. See, if you keep it private, nobody knows, maybe other children in society who are mumayyaz, they will not take their lesson. But if they see a child like them who's 10, 11, who stole, committed theft, and then was publicly disciplined, they will think twice. That will deter them. So yes, it seems from the hadith that it can be public or it should be public, so you have the deterrence effect.
I want to share a story with you guys.
Yes.
Back home in Lebanon, about 8 years ago, I used to live there. This boy, he was like 14. He took this other little boy with him to like a field, في بير, like
A well, yeah.
well.
Deep well.
Yeah, أنا بتضيع فيه well. الحرم, that boy was not seen for about 2-3 days, that 10-year-old boy. So then they found out that other boy,
He threw him in the well?
he abused him.
La ilaha
threw him in
illallah.
there. That child is...
Did he survive or he died?
No, he died. The child, they found him in the
Wow.
well. And they took the
La ilaha
13-year-old
illallah.
that did that to him. I think he's still in jail till now.
La ilaha
Because he's underage.
Yeah, they're minors, yeah. Qussar.
They're very sad.
La ilaha illallah. See, sometimes that could happen.
He was the only boy child.
The one who died.
He was
Haram.
11 years old, yeah.
Yeah, see, sometimes children can commit crimes.
Yeah.
So imagine, maybe, I'm not judging this 14-year-old boy, but maybe he's done other things when he was younger. Maybe he got away with them,
Yeah.
and he thought he could do that. Had he been disciplined, this may have been prevented. So remember, Islamic discipline is to bring order, to give you life, not to seek revenge from the people. Another Islamic law that applies to children, as the author discusses at the end of page 61, is تَمَلُّكُهُ بِالْحِيَازَةِ. A child can claim ownership of that which has no owner, that which is public for everyone in the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for instance, water. A child can go with a container to a river, to a lake, fill it with water, and then say, this water is mine. I can sell it, I can do whatever I want with it. Is that legal? Yes, just like an adult. وَالْأَعْشَابِ وَالْحَطَبِ, plants, vegetation out there in land that does not belong to anyone. Or if the person goes and collects wood, a child collects wood, he owns all of that. So even though a child is restricted in buying and selling in some transactions, but he can claim ownership of these items. That's the first part. The second part that the author discusses is al-luqata. Luqata is money that you find on the street, basically. First, let's examine the law that impacts the adult, and then let's see how this impacts children. If you as an adult, you see basically money on the street, or property, or gold, or something, can you claim it to yourself? If the money has absolutely no sign of who its owner could be, like a $100 bill, right? And you see it in a place, there's no way to trace the owner. There's no sign, no mark of ownership. There's absolutely no way to trace the owner. In that case, you can take it for yourself, no problem. It's mustahab to give it as sadaqah, but you don't have to. You can claim it for yourself. Regardless of the amount. It could be $1, it could be $100, it could be $1 million. If it absolutely has no sign of ownership, you can claim it to yourself. Okay. What if it has a sign? It has a sign. There is a way to find the owner technically. It's not just like a dollar bill. No. It's something that's unique that has a sign of ownership. In that case, what do? Scholars have said, first of all, you have to wait an entire year announcing on social media and your society that there is such an object. Whoever's the owner, come, show us the evidence, we'll give it to you. If after a year, no one comes to claim it, then you pay it as sadaqah. You still don't own it yourself. Now, what if someone says, why wait a year? I know for a fact the owner will no longer be here to find it. Let's say you just have yaqeen. It was during Hajj season, maybe in a place where there was a large gathering, millions of people came and everyone went back home. It's just no longer realistic for you to wait a year for the owner. That's it, the owner is gone. In that case, you give it as sadaqah. Now, the author says, a child can claim something that is lost money إِذَا كَانَ دُونَ الدِّرْهَمْ عَلَى قَوْلٍ. Scholars, when it comes to children, they're split into two groups. One group says the child is just like the adult. Whatever law applies to the adult applies to the child. The second group of scholars, they say a child can claim ownership of that money that you find on the street if the value of it is less than 1 dirham. A few dollars, let's say. But if it's a lot of money, no. We say to the child, you cannot claim ownership of it. It's not your money. But if it's less than a few dollars, then yes, you can claim it as your money. Some scholars have said this, but not all scholars.
So give it as sadaqah then. But he cannot give sadaqah.
No, the child cannot claim it. Have an adult come and deal with it. Yes, the child cannot claim it to himself anymore. Not that he takes it and he pays sadaqah. No, so an adult has to deal with it. Another law that applies in this heading is that if a child goes to a piece of property and land that's not owned by anyone, and he develops the land, the child plants seeds in this land, does this land become the ownership of this land? Is it given to the child? Yes. A child can do that. There's no problem. So these are just some examples of these laws that apply to children. Also, al-awlawiyya or al-sabq ila al-makan. If you reserve, let's say, a place in the masjid, a seat in the auditorium, can a child reserve a seat for himself? Meaning, if he showed up first, can he sit there? Yes, he can. In public places. Having said all of that, the author now reaches the very important discussion that's applicable to the book of transactions. What about the aqd of the sabi? Transactions, buying, selling, renting. Can a child do that or no? Basically, the author says that the popular opinion, al-mashhur, amongst the fuqaha and scholars, is that if the child is not mumayyiz, younger than 10, 8, definitely the aqd is batil. Any type of transaction that the child engages in is invalid. That's the mashhur, the popular opinion. Even if later the guardian approved. Let's say your 5-year-old child goes and buys something, and then you, as the father, as the guardian of the child, you say, I approved of this transaction. We say, no. That's not good enough. It doesn't work that way. Because your child did not have the capacity to even issue a transaction. So there is no transaction for you to even approve of. Islamically, that's not even a transaction. Okay. And the reason that these scholars have mentioned is rufi' al-qalam. The pen has been lifted. So a child technically cannot engage in any type of transaction because there's no effect to his actions. And a hadith from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam in which he states, "Amdu as-sabi wa khata'uhu wahid." That which a child does deliberately and that which a child does accidentally is equal. What does that mean? You as an adult, when you do something accidentally, does it have a binding effect? No. Therefore, a child, he cannot issue a transaction because his transaction is like an accident that an adult will commit. That's the meaning of it. Okay. The author says, that's the mashhur. However, a group of scholars beg to differ. They say no. We don't accept that children cannot engage in any transaction. They have said, these scholars, that if the child is of maturity to know what he's doing, to engage in a transaction, then we will allow this transaction. This transaction is valid. Some of them say you need the guardian's permission. Some of them say no. Even if the guardian does not approve. As long as the child knows what he's doing, he's of that maturity, let him decide what he wants with his own money. And he says many scholars have said this. One of them is Fakhr al-Muhaqqiqeen. Fakhr al-Muhaqqiqeen is the son of Al-Allama al-Hilli, of a top scholar. Sayyid Kadhim al-Yazdi, one of the Maraja of Najaf. Shaykh al-Ardabili, Sayyid Muhsin al-Hakim, and other scholars. He's mentioning pillars in Islamic law who've said that children can engage in transactions. What's the problem? Now, if you ask these scholars, what is the evidence that you have? What's the proof that a child can engage in such transactions? What's the answer? They say that the evidence that we have is Siratul Uqala and Siratul Mutasharra'a. And we don't see the Imams of Ahlul Bayt speaking out against the Sirah. So we can conclude the approval of the Imams. What's Siratul Uqala? Break it down. What's Sirah? The way. What is Uqala? Rational people. It just means rational people in society. Siratul Uqala is basically the common practice of rational people in society. These scholars are saying, look how interestingly in Islamic law you can make an argument using Siratul Uqala. These scholars are saying when you go to any society, rational people, we're not talking about crazy people or a fringe group of people, no. Rational people, they do allow their children to buy and sell, if they have maturity, they know right from wrong, they are mumayyiz. A father will allow his son to go to the supermarket and buy something, or he gives him an allowance, right? $20 a month, and then he tells him, do whatever you want with it. So we find that this is a common practice in all societies around the world, that children who have that level of maturity, they can decide what happens with their money. They can buy and sell, no problem. And we don't find that the Imams of Ahlul Bayt specifically condemned this practice, so we can assume that the Imams were okay with this practice. Therefore, let's allow children to buy and sell, no problem. That's Siratul Uqala. And then the author says, in addition to that, we also have Siratul Mutasharra'a. Not just the practice of common people, like even non-Muslims. No, even righteous Muslims. If you go to the holy cities of Qom, Najaf, Karbala, historically, you even find many scholars, for instance, or people who are righteous and they care about Sharia, you find their children would buy and sell certain things. Therefore, that gives us confidence that this is okay in Islamic law. How do you feel about this kind of argument? Do you feel that they make a valid case here?
It's good. It teaches a kid to be responsible since, at a young age.
Well, that's the wisdom behind it. From a fiqh perspective, is the case they're making sound like a sound argument, powerful case?
It's still on the gray.
They're saying it's a common practice amongst the uqala, rational people. We don't find the Sharia law condemning that. So that means the Imams were okay with this practice. Because if they were not okay with it, they would have specifically condemned it, like they condemned many things which violated the law of God. But we don't find the Imams condemning this in specific. Therefore, we can conclude that it's okay. We're sinning. So we can conclude that that reflects the spirit of Sharia. If Sharia was against this, then definitely we would have seen the righteous people avoid that. The fact that they don't avoid it means from day one, it's probably okay. That's their argument.
Makes sense.
In any case, remember, not all Maraja have accepted this. A few Maraja have accepted this, but a lot of scholars beg to differ. They say no. We go back to the first group that says it's not allowed. Yes, brother.
They still require the guardians.
Yes, they require the guardian's approval, these scholars. So if the guardian approves it, why not? Let the child do that. But the first group, they say no. Even if the guardian approves, no, you don't have a transaction. It's not a valid transaction. The second group says no, it's okay. The third group, in fact, the third group states, even if it's not with the permission of the guardian, it's still okay. And Al-Muhaqqiq Al-Ardabili, who was one of the great Maraja of the past, that was his opinion. If the child knows what he's doing, khalas, let him do what he wants. Why do you need the guardian's approval? A fourth category of scholars, they have maintained that if the child is buying petty things, al-ashya al-haqira, cheap things, petty things, inexpensive things, it's okay. We approve their transactions. But if they're buying something expensive, no.
This makes sense to me.
This makes sense?
As a mom, yes, it makes sense. Like say buying candy or something like that, it's fine, but they're going to go buy something.
The author says, what is the author's opinion? He says, my opinion is, why is it that the Sharia law allowed a child who becomes baligh to do everything that he wants with his money? Because now the child has maturity. So what's important here is the maturity, not the age of the child. He says, that's what I understand from the spirit of Sharia. That's why, and he says, this is an important part of his discussion. He says, and that's why, if the child becomes baligh, 14, 15, but the child is a fool, reckless, not insane, but reckless, according to Islamic law, is the child allowed to use his money and make his own transactions? No, a child is safi. Inshallah, later we'll examine in the book of Safi how a reckless, foolish person is restricted and they cannot use their own property. The author says, why? You have a baligh person who in Islamic law is an adult, but you still restrict him. Why? Because he does not have that level of maturity. Therefore, what's key over here is maturity, not the age. Therefore, if a child is 10, but he has that level of maturity, let him decide what happens with his money. Whether it's a small amount or a big amount, doesn't matter, as long as the child has that level of maturity. That's his opinion. And then some scholars even interestingly mention some children are savvier than their parents. You could have an 11-year-old child savvier than his parents. He knows more about transactions, right? Some kids are really bright. So let them engage in transactions. What is the problem? So that's what the author mentions. Now this maturity, what do we call it in Arabic? Rushd. Rushd in Arabic means level of maturity that allows you to look after your own interests. You know what you're doing. That's what it means. Have you seen some kids? They know what they're doing. They know how to calculate, how to do pros and cons. They're smart. They know how to seek their benefit. Okay, if they're at that age and they'd like to engage in transactions, the author says let them. Because we understand from the spirit of Sharia that what counts is the level of maturity, not the age. Now, why did many hadiths mention bulugh? Because normally, at bulugh, a child has that level of maturity to kind of know what he or she is doing. Otherwise, bulugh is just a sign of maturity. If you know that the child has that maturity before bulugh, let them engage in transactions. We don't see any problem with that. And then he mentions a hadith. He says, Al-Shaykh al-Tusi mentions in his book Al-Mabsut, he says, Ruwiya. There's a hadith. إِذَا بَلَغَ عَشْرُ سِنِينَ, if the child becomes 10, وَكَانَ رَشِيدًا, he has rushd. What's rushd? Maturity. كَانَ جَائِزَ التَّصَرُّف, he can deal as he wishes with his property. So we even have a hadith, it's a weak hadith, does it have a strong chain? Because it's a disconnected chain. But in the end, there's a hadith that even supports that. So the author says what we can conclude, that children by default are not allowed to use their property, to buy or sell, until they become baligh or they show maturity before that. If they display maturity, rushd, before that, then we let them. And remember those hadiths from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, in which the Imam stated, a child, if he's 10, he can give sadaqah, he can issue a wasiyah. These scholars have said, okay. So when the Imam is telling you that he can donate, he can't buy a bag of chips, why? If the child has that maturity, then let him do what he wants with his money. Any questions on that? What do you say?
The author states that if a child or even someone who's baligh is a fool, they shouldn't be able to access their property.
Yes, that is, there's consensus on that.
What would you say about an adult that's a fool?
Yeah, that's what we're saying. A baligh is an adult.
No, like a 20, 30-year-old.
Yes, a 50-year-old person. We have, inshallah, a chapter in Islamic law in which we talk about the safi. Safi is the one who's a fool or reckless. Like if you give him $1,000, he'll spend it in 5 seconds on silly issues. This person is a safi. This person, according to Islamic law, yuhjar alayh. You restrict him. It's his money. You don't give him access. He says, no. You need a guardian to authorize what you're doing because you're reckless. You're a safi. This applies to adults. And the author is using this argument. He's like, see, we understand from hukm al-safi that it's the maturity that authorizes you to make transactions. You could be an adult, but if you don't have the maturity, you can't. So that means if there's a child who has that maturity, let him, because it's the maturity that counts. Yeah, the Safi applies to adults, definitely. We have an entire chapter in Islamic law about this. The person is an adult. You tell him, no, sorry. You have $1 million, you don't have access to it. With restrictions, we let you use it. You can't just unconditionally go and use that money. Have you seen some people? They're reckless. They're reckless with their spending. I remember once, and we'll conclude with this. I remember there was a documentary. One of the, I don't know, businesses, companies, corporations, they randomly went to the street and they saw basically a homeless person who was completely bankrupt, begging for money. So they went to that person and they gave him a very big amount of money, like $100,000 or maybe $1 million. I can't remember the exact figure. Either $100,000 or $1 million. They told him, here. And the intent was to study what the person does with it. They came back a while after, let's say a year after. They saw the person begging in that same corner. We give you $1 million. What happened? They discovered the person recklessly spent the $1 million in 1 year. Did not invest, did not buy himself a good property. He just spent it on silly things. See, this person is a safi, fool. This person in Islamic law does not have full access to his money because he will squander it and waste it in a few days.
What if he donated it?
If you donate the money to the point where you're homeless, that is recklessness. And we have verses about that, and we have hadiths about that. Don't go too far. If you have a family, you need a shelter, a roof, and you donate all of your money, you're not allowed, yes. You're not allowed to donate all of your money such that you become homeless. This is not what Allah wants from you. This is recklessness. Yes, you donate half of it, 60% of it, but you still have your own livelihood, that's fine. That's not being reckless. But to donate all of it is recklessness. We have a question here. This is strong evidence that it's practiced around Imam's time, and they did not say anything. Majority of scholars are in which opinion? So, honestly, the majority of scholars have ruled that, yeah, a child cannot buy or sell, period. So I would say that's probably the majority of scholars. It's just their understanding that we have hadiths that's very clear. Rufa al-qalam, that's it. A child who's not baligh, they're not allowed to deal with their property. And they feel these hadiths are enough to make a statement about the public practice. That's their opinion. If you ask them, well, why didn't the Imam say something when there was a common practice of rational people allowing their children to engage in transactions? They're like, yeah, the Imams did. Well, where? In these hadiths, where the Imam says a child who's not baligh, that's it. The pen has been lifted. That means they can't buy, they can't sell, they can't do anything. To them, it's clear. The Imam has already made his statement. So I would say yes, the majority of scholars have probably ruled historically that a child who's not baligh cannot buy or sell. Once they become baligh, then they have that authority. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.